Welcome to the Psychexp channel. In this video, I'm going to be showing you how you can make a scenario experiment in under 30 seconds, and then I will show you how you can customize it to make it your own. In a scenario experiment, the participants are presented with a scenario and are asked to respond to how they would behave in that type of situation. In Psychexp, you can choose from two types of scenario experiment design. The first type is a between subjects design, where the participant is presented with just one scenario block that is randomly selected from amongst multiple scenario blocks that have been included in the scenario experiment. The second type is a within subjects design, where the participant is presented one by one with all of the blocks in the scenario experiment. All the blocks are firstly shuffled so that each participant receives a different random order. Let's take a look at how we can very easily create a scenario experiment by firstly logging in to psychexp.com. Once you have logged in, select Add New Project from the menu, enter a name for your project, and then click the Submit button. You will be returned to the dashboard where you will see the project you just created in the project list. Click on Open, and then on the next screen, click Edit Project. When you first create a project in Psychexp, a default block and a default question are inserted. So let's now insert our scenario experiment underneath this default block. Scroll down to the bottom of the page and click on Add Experiment. Select Scenario Experiment from the list of experiments and then click Submit. If you scroll down the page, you will now see that a fully functional scenario experiment has been inserted and is ready to use. But let's now customize this default scenario experiment to make it your own. The default scenario experiment contains an experiment block where you make changes to the settings, and then beneath it there are two scenario blocks which each contain slightly different scenarios. The first scenario block is numbered #8. And the second block is #14. You can change the name of the experiment block, which is currently named default block, to make it easier to distinguish. Simply click on the edit icon. The scenario experiment is currently set to include all the blocks down to and including the block numbered #14. So looking at the flow of our blocks, it will currently include the blocks numbered #8 and #14. We can add more blocks to the scenario by simply clicking on the Add Block button. Once you have added the block, there are two ways to include it in the scenario flow. Firstly, you can move it up higher in the flow than the block numbered #14 by using the up arrow button. Alternatively, you can leave it where it is below the #14 block and change the drop-down in the scenario experiment settings block to the hash number of this new block. I'm going to put it back to where it was originally placed, beneath block #14. This block number is #20, so let's leave it under the #14 block and change the settings to include it in the scenario experiment. All we need to do is change the drop-down in the scenario settings accordingly to this #20. If I scroll back up to the scenario block settings, I can simply select #20 default block from the drop-down list. The scenario experiment will now include the blocks numbered #8, #14, and also #20. You can change the question type of each of the questions in a scenario block by clicking on the question and selecting the type from the drop-down list. In order to change the default text of the scenario question, click on the Edit button. You can have as many questions as you like in each scenario block. To add a question to any of the scenario blocks, simply click on the Add Question button. To make the flow of this scenario experiment easier to understand, I'm going to label each scenario so we can later see how the randomization of the scenario blocks is working. I will add the label Scenario 1 to the question in the first scenario block. Scenario 2 to the question in the second scenario block. And finally, I'm going to add Scenario 3 to the question in the third block. Scrolling back up to the scenario experiment settings block, you will see that there is firstly a single text-only screen that explains the procedure of the experiment to the participant. This screen is shown before the scenario questions are displayed. This initial text screen is fully customizable, and you can also add extra text screens by clicking the Add Text Only Page button. If we click on the Settings button for the Scenario Experiment block, we can select from the Between Subjects and Within Subjects design for our experiment. If we select the Between Subjects design, which is the default setting, this would mean that just one block would be randomly selected and presented to the participant from the 3 blocks that are included. Our current project has just one question in each block. However, if we add more questions to any of the scenario blocks, then all of the questions in the block that is randomly selected by the Between Subjects design will be displayed. If we select the Within Subjects design for this current project, this would mean that the 3 blocks included in our scenario experiment would firstly be shuffled, and then all 3 blocks would be presented to the participant one by one in the shuffled order. If there is more than one question in any of the scenario blocks, then all of the questions will be displayed before moving to the next scenario block. Let's take a look at a preview of our experiment so we can see the difference between the two designs. Before we take a look at the preview though, I'm going to add another block underneath our current scenario experiment and change the question type to a slider so it's easier to see where the scenario experiment starts and ends. This new question block is lower than block #20, so it will not be included in the randomization of blocks for the scenario experiment. Now let's click the preview button to see the flow of the default between subjects design. We will firstly see the default question that was inserted when we first created this project. This question is not part of the scenario experiment. On the next screen, the scenario experiment information page is shown. Next, just one of the scenario blocks will be randomly shown. In this case, scenario 3 was selected. Now the final slider block that is not part of the scenario experiment is shown. I will now change the scenario settings to a within subjects design. And once again, I will now click on the preview button. Again, we firstly see the default question that was inserted when we first created this project. On the next screen, the scenario experiment information page is shown. And now all of the 3 scenario blocks will be shown in random order. The first one is scenario 3. Next is scenario 2. And finally, scenario 1. After that, the final slider block that is not part of the scenario experiment is shown. Please note that you can view the preview as often as you want at any time during the building of the project. The screens shown in the preview are exactly the same as the respondents will see when they click on the live survey or experiment. However, no data from the preview is recorded in the dataset. Once you are happy with the design of your project, if you are ready to distribute your project to your respondents, click on the QR code link to get the individual QR code or link for this project. Be aware that once you give the QR code or link to a respondent, and he or she completes the survey or experiment, you will no longer be able to edit any aspects of the project in the Edit Project screen. It is important that you make sure your project is exactly the way you require it by checking the project preview prior to distributing your project. Before distributing your survey or experiment, you will also need to set various project settings on the Project Settings page. Click on Project Settings in the menu to open the Settings page. The settings are divided into 2 categories: Basic and Advanced Settings. The basic settings can be changed even after respondents have completed the survey or experiment. However, advanced settings can only be changed prior to any respondent's participation. The basic settings allow you to change items such as the registration page logo and the message displayed at the end of the survey or experiment. The advanced settings control whether a respondent can do the survey or experiment only once or multiple times. You can also select whether the respondent needs to register with an email address prior to starting. If you select a closed access project, Only respondents with a pre-registered email address can respond. You can pre-register the email address of your respondents in a closed access project by clicking on the Respondents tab in the menu. Once your project has been distributed and respondents have completed your survey or experiment, you can download the data at any time by clicking the Dataset tab in the menu. Prior to downloading the data, you will need to set the dataset column headings and save the changes. Each column heading must be unique, and only alphanumeric characters can be used. If you have a scenario experiment in your project, you'll be able to download both a summary dataset and a detailed dataset that shows a line-by-line report of each scenario block shown to the respondent. The summary dataset for a between subjects scenario, shown here on the top left, shows the single block that was randomly selected and presented to the participant in the block order column. The milliseconds shows the amount of time spent from the start until the end of the whole scenario experiment. In a within subjects design, the block order column shows the blocks in the order they were presented to the participant. The milliseconds column shows the amount of time spent on answering all of the blocks in the scenario experiment. To see a breakdown of the time spent on each block, download the detailed dataset that is shown here on the right. Well, that's all I have for you in this video. I hope you have enjoyed it and found it to be informative. Please check out all of the other tutorial videos on the Psychexp channel to learn about all of the experiments you can insert and customize in your Psychexp projects.